Okay, this is round two. No, I'm just teasing. Okay, we're gonna go into chapter one. A lot of you did not receive the YouTube video, so we're gonna do this again. And this time we're gonna cover all of the systems in one lump sum. The first one we're gonna talk about will be the cardiorespiratory system. So I'm gonna give you a close-up here. Okay, now when we look at the term cardio, of course, which will be the top left-hand corner. Cardio basically has to do with the heart and blood vessels. Specifically, when we're talking about vessels, we're talking about arterioles, arteries, veins, and venules, along with the capillaries. Just to note, arterioles and venules are smaller versions of arteries and veins, respectively, and capillaries are the smallest blood vessels among them. When we're talking about respiratory, that has to do with um, lungs, trachea, mouth, and nose. So these are the critters that will help us to breathe properly, to take in oxygen, and to expel carbon dioxide out of our bodies. Now, one thing I want you to know is when you look at the term SPIR, SPIR, it literally means to breathe. So think about it this way: when we're talking about RE, it means again or back. So it's like we are breathing again. So think about ventilation. We're inhaling and we're exhaling. Inhaling, exhaling. So we're breathing in and out, back and forth. So respiratory. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so now you can't see the right side, but it basically says pulmonary. So I'm sorry, it's systemic on the right side. So when we're looking at uh, the right side of the heart, we're talking about pulmonary. Now, from your one video, you should have seen the left and right sides of the heart, one having be blue, the other one being red. Well, the blue one um, signifies the pulmonary side, the right side. Okay, why is it blue? Of course, because the carbon dioxide, and there's very little oxygen on that side. So, let's start here. Use your imagination. So when we take in oxygen from the environment, oxygen is basically used by tissues in our bodies before the blood takes the gas into the heart. Okay, so oxygen has been consumed and utilized by tissues for energy. However, the tissues give us a very raw deal. Instead of giving us back oxygen, which would have been nice, they give us carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide is that waste product. If we have too much carbon dioxide, then our bodies will go into shock. So now the carbon dioxide is being taken to the heart. Of course, you see where it says from. What I really meant to say is pulmonary. When we're talking about pulmonary, that means literally from the heart and to the lungs. Okay, so don't pay too much attention to this side here, to this word I'm covering up. So carbon dioxide is actually taken to the heart by way of the vena cava. Vena cava are two large veins that are attached to the right side of the heart. So superior and inferior vena cava, top and bottom, the blood runs simultaneously through these veins. Now, once the blood, which has a lot of carbon dioxide, reaches into the heart through these veins, they enter what's called the right atrium. The right atrium now has the blood. Okay, now the right atrium holds the blood, but then with one shock into the cardiac muscle, it now goes into the right ventricle. The right ventricle now ejects the blood that has the carbon dioxide out of the heart, but before it goes out of the heart, it goes right through what's called the pulmonary artery. Now, I want you to look at the term pulmonary artery for a moment. Now, as you can see from the bottom right-hand corner, you see the term away. Think about it this way. When you think about A, the very first vowel of that word, artery, it basically means away. So that's one way you can remember. So the blood is being pushed away from the heart by the ventricle into into the lung. Pulmonary, well, pulmon means lung. So think about that way. Artery takes the blood away from the heart and to the lung. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and talk right about the lungs, speaking of which. Before we talk about the lungs, I want you to know that arteries, as I mentioned before, arteries are actually a larger form of what are called arterioles. Arterioles are smaller forms of the arteries. Why are we just talking about arteries and arterioles? As we move into the lung now, as we move into the lung, the vessel becomes smaller and smaller in order to fit into the lung. So the artery becomes an arteriole, and then the arteriole becomes smaller and smaller until it becomes a capillary itself. And the capillary is actually now small enough that it can be inside the lung. The lungs are responsible for gas exchange. The lungs are responsible for gas exchange. So, what are the two components that we are concerned with? So, inside the lungs, you have what are called a bronchus singular, bronchi plural. Bronchi are tree-like structures that are actually inside of the lungs, but they start to break down. They start to divide and become smaller themselves until they become what are called alveoli or air sacs. Okay, so we're going to go down here, and that's what I just basically explained. You have the bronchi, and the bronchi branch off into alveoli, the air sacs. Now, the capillaries now have the carbon dioxide inside the blood, whereas the oxygen, of course, are from the alveoli. So this is where the exchange takes place. Now, once there's that exchange, the capillaries are now enriched with the oxygen, but now the carbon dioxide now, which is now taken by the blood, is now being expelled from the body and out through the nose, mouth, from those lungs. Now, as Atticus mentioned before in class, the environment now uses that carbon dioxide, especially plants, for photosynthesis. So, in basically, you're manufacturing food and water. So, carbon dioxide isn't a bad thing when it comes to the environment. It's just a really bad thing for us as humans. Okay, now that same oxygen is going to be transferred out of the capillaries now, and the capillaries now become venules. The venules now, given more and more of them, become a vein. And now the vein is attached to the left side of the heart, which we call the systemic side, as we mentioned before. Now the oxygen returns to the heart by uh, ways of the vein. But collectively, the veins are now known as the pulmonary trunk. Don't be confused by the terms pulmonary artery like you had on the other side of pulmonary trunk. In this case, pulmonary trunk sends blood, oxygenated blood, back to the heart. Okay, so if you saw that one video, then you know that the trunks and the artery are two entirely different entities. Now, the blood is actually going to be sent from the trunk to the left atria, which in turn will send the blood, after the heartbeat, it will send the blood to the left ventricle. Now, the left ventricle has a very important job, okay? The left ventricle now takes the oxygenated blood now and actually pushes it out to the rest of the body, but by way of the really big artery we call the aorta. The aorta now distributes that blood back to those same tissues that gave us the raw deal before. Now they're going to take the oxygen, which now the aorta just gave to them. The aorta just gave that blood right to them, and in turn they're going to go ahead and put that carbon dioxide right back into the blood, and it starts the whole process all over again. Okay, that's the cardiorespiratory system. So what I just explained was the pathway of the cardiorespiratory system. All right, now the next one we're going to talk about will be the muscular system. The muscular system is really important. Now, this is where a lot of us gym rats are really concerned. We're trying to look cut, ripped, bulk, whatever. Six pack going on. Hey. All right. Now, we're going to talk about skeletal muscle. Now, that actually accounts for almost half of one's own body weight. Okay, so specifically about 40%. Now, it's responsible for voluntary movement, but one thing I need for you to know, and that you already see, is different from the other types of muscle tissue. So whereas skeletal muscle is involved in voluntary movement, that's movement at will, smooth and cardiac, of course, are are involved in involuntary movement. Okay, so in other words, we don't have any control over that. It's probably result of the endocrine system. Okay, which we're also going to talk about in a little bit. Now back to the other types of muscles. Excuse me. Smooth muscle is found in the hollow walls of organs. So one example would be your large and small intestines, and also cardiac. Of course, no brainer has to do with the heart. Okay, the difference between another difference between smooth and cardiac muscles, other than the fact that they serve different purposes, is that smooth does not have stripes, whereas cardiac does. Okay, it's striated. All right, now let's go ahead now back to the skeletal muscle, along with I'm sorry, the muscular system, along with the skeletal system and the nervous system. Skeletal muscle produces movement and force. Speaking of which, I'm sorry, I'm moving all around here. It generates heat. And how do you generate heat? Well, you use calories, and calories are units of heat. Okay, so think about in the really cold, very erratic Chicago winter, when you're shivering and all that, guess what? Not only are you shivering, but you are basically helping your body to produce heat. So when you're doing that shaking and all that, that's basically movement that will produce that energy, and energy comes in the form of calories being burned. Okay, and it also serves as an acid-base buffer. Okay, that it's nice. So if your body becomes too acidic, you're drinking a lot of pop, or if it becomes too basic, in other words, you got a lot of protein in your system, a lot of ketosis going on, then it basically helps to even your pH levels out. Okay, and now glucose and glycogen. Glycogen, of course, is stored glucose. The muscle serves a purpose in that it stores sugars for energy. So it's like your energy reserve system. Okay. All right. So now that's skeletal muscle. Now we're going to talk about the three layers of skeletal muscle. Okay. Now, as you saw from Saturday, there were three different types of layers. You have what's called epimysium. Now, when we look at the term epimysium, epimysium basically means over the membrane of the muscle. EPI means over or above. MYS means muscle. IUM means layer or membrane. So we're making this a working definition. It basically means the outermost layer of skeletal muscle. Um, is different. So epimysium is different from the others in that it actually is connected to tendon, which we talked about on Saturday, especially with the Golgi tendon organ. Okay, paramecium now. Paramecium is actually right underneath the epimysium, but now, of course, it's known as the middle layer, but it actually groups a whole bunch of muscle cells or fibers, and those muscle cells or fibers are known as a fasciculus. Now, in some textbooks, it will say a fascicle, but in this case, because of course it sounds Greek, we'll say or Latin, it says fasciculus. Okay, lastly, endomesia. Okay, no brainer. When you think about ENDO, it almost sounds like inside, right? So literally it means innermost layer of skeletal muscle. Okay, now different from paramecium, I want to make sure that you don't confuse the two. Paramecium combines all of the muscle fibers together to make up a fasciculus, whereas the endomysium encases them. They're separated inside of this layer. They're not grouped together, so to speak, but they're actually separated. So think about actin and myosin. Actin and myosin are your myofilaments. Okay, so it doesn't mean that they're all grouped in together like the paramecium. They're just actually they're like their own little entity. There's one cell next to another cell next to another, but they're all separated, and the actin myosin are inside of those fibers. Okay, they're like their own little colonies. Speaking of actin and myosin, what I want you to know that they are inside what's called a sarcomere. A sarcomere, guys, you gotta know this. If nothing else, if you don't remember anything else, please know that the sarcomere is known as your basic functional unit of skeletal muscle. Again, I repeat, the sarcomere is your basic functional unit of skeletal muscle. Okay, now I draw this funky little diagram. Forgive the drawing. I'm definitely not an artist. My brother is in comparison. So actin is known as the thin myofilament. Is also light. In contrast, myosin is the thin myofilament and it's a little darker. So the shades here I have, the ones that are slightly light and all that, again, this is not a really good diagram. The darker ones are the myosin myofilaments. The lighter ones are known as the actin myofilaments. So what's happening? Um, if I can do this, let's say for example, if you can see here. Okay, you know what? Okay, I think. Okay, you know what? This isn't working. So what I was going to do is I was going to overlap my fingers together and make almost like they're joined in together. Okay, when it's almost like when you bring the two lines in together, you're overlapping. You're overlapping. Okay, that's what. So when you're overlapping, then you're producing concentric contraction, which we talked about Saturday. So when you're overlapping, it's based on what's called the sliding filament theory. Now, calcium is stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, that's a nice long-term dates, but what does it mean? Sarcoplasmic reticulum is basically a network of tubules, little tubes. Um, Okay, think about pipes in the ceiling. You got pipes right in the ceiling as part of the framework. That's basically it. Now think about a lot of calcium inside of those pipes, okay? And they're being released after a shock from the nerve. That's what's happening. So calcium actually is being released, and it causes proteins to interact with each other. And when those proteins, by the way, myosin and actin are proteins, okay? And when they start to cross over each other and they start to pull, guess what? You got a shortening of the muscle. And that's movement. That's voluntary movement, okay? And it's a cool thing. All right. The next one, digestive system. Did anyone have a cheeseburger this morning? All right, when we're talking about, I know it's cheesy. All right, now when we're talking about the digestive system, they're broken down into 6 regions: the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, and the intestines, small and large. Now I did this on purpose. I drew 2 lines so you know exactly what's happening. Mouth, when you chew up the food, it becomes a ball of a ball of spit, a ball of chewed up particles of food. It's basically called a bolus. Think about, if this helps, a bolus meaning ball, all right? Now, when talking about esophagus now, I'm sorry, the stomach has enzymes and also hydrochloric acid, okay? It breaks down the bolus into what's called chyme. Chyme is broken down further and further until those same nutrients are now being absorbed by what are called villi. Villi are actual small like proctiles coming up from the walls of the intestines. And each villus, of course singular for villi, each villus actually has capillaries. Capillaries take the nutrients from the villi and they actually send them to the organs and tissues that need them. Okay. Okay. Now, speaking of nutrients, this actually is covered in chapter 2, which also I sent to you by YouTube. Now, we got what are called macronutrients. Macronutrients are taken in large quantities. Macronutrients, we're talking about fats, we're talking about carbohydrates, and we're talking about proteins. Again, we're talking about fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. So let's talk about what's happening here. Now, remember we were talking about that stomach, and the stomach has the enzymes and it has the hydrochloric acid. Well, one of the enzymes, especially when it comes to fat, that's called lipase, Lipase. Remember, not all the time. Um, ASE means enzymes. We're going to have some other enzymes that will not end in ASE. So please make a note of that. But back to this, the fats are being broken down by lipase, and in turn, that product. Oh, by the way, triglycerides are stored fats. The triglycerides are being broken down into what are called fatty acids. Okay. Now, during this time, the fatty acids are being produced um, through a process called aerobic glycolysis. So when you look at chapter 2 video on aerobic glycolysis on exercise physiology, you'll know what it is. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this video talking about it. Okay, let's go into the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, in this case, this enzyme amylase is breaking down the carbohydrates into simpler sugars. Okay, of course, in this case, the sugars are being broken down for energy, and carbohydrates are a primary source of energy. Now, not to say the fats aren't important, but fats are usually needed through needed in activities that require um, aerobic capacity, a lot of endurance, whereas carbohydrates are needed for power, strength, and speed. And the end result, um, and it's going through a process what's called anaerobic glycolysis, again, which is mentioned in your chapter 2 video. Okay, and finally, we're talking about proteins. Proteins are needed for body maintenance, hair, nails, hormones, things like that. One of your hormones is like hemoglobin that's found in the red blood cell. So it has also, like the other two macronutrients, it's also very important. However, now as gym rats, proteins are definitely needed, especially for to maintain or increase lean body tissue. Now, the enzyme that's needed for this would be what's called chemotrypsin. Chemotrypsin, like I mentioned before, don't always think that ASE always indicates, it does indicate enzyme, but enzymes don't always end in ASE. Okay, so please make a note of that. Chemotrypsin breaks down the proteins, and as a result, no, the proteins are now 20 amino acids in your urea. Okay, so nitrogen, basically in layman's term. Now, when you're breaking down fats, carbohydrates, and protein, the end result, what's being manufactured, what's being produced, is what's called ATP. ATP is your energy molecule, and it stands for adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate. Okay, now we're going to go. The second half of chapter 1 will be devoted to skeletal system, nervous system, and we may go ahead and talk about endocrine system. I'm not going to promise you on the last one, but we're definitely going to talk about skeletal and nervous system the second half of this video.